Hello students, this is a recording for Biology 1407. This is the fourth chapter in Unit 4, Chapter 31 in the OpenStax Biology textbook, Soil and Plant Nutrition. All right, so most plants, there are exceptions, but the vast majority of plants live in some sort of soil, some sort of substrate, and obtain their water from that soily substrate. There are some aerial trees that are plants that live in very, very humid environments where they can collect moisture out of the air, but those are very much exceptions to the rule. That substrate is the source of water most typically, and of course the structure for pulling water out of the soil or whatever substrate is going to be the root system of the plant. And particularly, soil is water from the soil is drawn in by that root system and is introduced into the vascular bundle across the Casparian strips that we spoke of in the last recording. Remember that endodermis that enforces selective transport of materials across the cell membranes of those endodermal cells right there, instead of through the apoplastic route, the pathways from one cell wall to another cell wall that can bypass the actual cell membranes inside a plant. There's an apoplastic route for materials to move through a plant, but in the endodermis that's restricted. And once water gets into the vascular cylinder, it's introduced into the xylem of the vascular cylinder and transported to other parts of the plant via the passive process of evapotranspiration as the primary motive means. Along with water are going to come essential nutrients that are dissolved in that water. Most of the items on that list, on this list right here on this page, do come from water. Macronutrients refer to elements that are needed in large amounts by a plant. Micronutrients refer to elements that are needed in small amounts by plants. So when we're talking about plants, nutrients are normally inorganic compounds, in elemental form. For instance, carbon comes into a plant in the form of carbon dioxide, which is an inorganic molecule. And that's one exception. Carbon dioxide comes in through the air, is taken in through stomata on, modern plants. But everything else here is going to come dissolved in water, including nitrogen in soluble forms, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Again, these are macronutrients because they're needed in large amounts regularly all the time by all plants. Magnesium, for instance, is a key element in the center of the chlorophyll molecule, so lots of this is needed. It fulfills a similarly important role in plants, different, but a similarly important role for a metal ion as, say, iron does in hemoglobin in vertebrates. The micronutrients are also required for plants, but in smaller amounts and more occasionally. They can be, very tiny amounts are needed. A lot of these are recycled inside plant tissues. But they are required in order to form all of the enzymes that are required for a plant to function. And like magnesium, quite typically, with the exception of sodium right here and chlorine, quite typically these ions are going to be reaction centers of some enzyme. All right. As it says right here, cellulose, the main structural component of plant wall, makes up about 30% of plant matter, and that's averaging out between herbaceous plants, which are all green and relatively soft, and woody plants, with stems made out of large amounts of dead xylem, which is going to be a lot of cellulose. So in some plants, a lot more than 30% of the mass is cellulose, but even in herbaceous plants, there's still a very, very major component of that plant is the cellulose of cell walls. And as I've told you all before, it is the most abundant organic compound on Earth, that carbohydrate. The most abundant protein on Earth is going to be rubisco, the enzymatic protein that binds CO2 to its intermediate in the Calvin cycle in photosynthesis. All right. So let's talk about soil, the source of water and minerals. And, there's two components right there. So, as it says here, organic soils rather obviously are going to contain a lot of organic matter, and that's going to be debris from other plants and animals, so bits and pieces of still organic material. So bits and pieces of carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, carbohydrates, and the cellulose of dead leaves would be an example of that, organic matter right there. And then mineral soils consist of the broken down products of erosion, of chemical and mechanical erosion of rock, of course. And a good soil is really a mixture of both of these. It's going to have mineral components and it's going to have organic components. So soil, proper soil, consists of these two components right here. As a generalization, about 40 to 45% of the soil should be mineral matter. So that's broken up bits and pieces of rock, sand, clay, mica chips, what have you. All the small little bits that make up soil that come from these mineral soil sources right here. The organic matter should be about 5% of the soil by volume. It can be more. There's many soils that are more, but this is what works well for cropping purposes. And then in good soil to grow plants in, somewhat counterintuitively for most people, there should be air and water, but quite a bit of air in that soil. It shouldn't be saturated with water. So, saturated soil, that's completely full of water, doesn't have any air in it, and plants can't grow well in that environment. So the mixture of air and water should be about 50% of that soil volume. So this pie chart right here is a good way to commit that to memory. Do be able to recreate this pie chart right here. 45% inorganic, 5% organic, and then reasonably a 50-50 split of water and air right here as the remainder. 50-50 split of the 50%, so 25%, 25% split of water and air making up the other half of the soil volume. All right. So a little more detail and some terminology that you do need to know. The proper name for the mixture of organic matter in the soil is humus. Humus, all right? So topsoil typically contains a lot of humus. The deeper layers of soil have less and less of this. And that consists of living microorganisms and the dead debris of microorganisms, plants, and animals, all in, as it says right here, in various stages of decay. The inorganic component of soil should be broken down rock. We don't really want big rocks in there. Some are going to be inevitable. It depends on soil. But for maximum utility for plants, and of course what we look for in agriculture, where we try and optimize soil structure, is that the largest particles of the soil are going to be the sand bits, and it says right here up to 2 millimeters in diameter. So these are relatively large. They add volume and surface area to the soil. Silt, these are much, much smaller pieces of, what was sand, of what was rock, down as low as 0.002 millimeters or up to 1/10 of a millimeter, 100 micrometers right here. And then clay. Clay is much, much smaller particles, a huge amount of surface area because of their small sizes right here. So, a certain amount of clay gives us a terrific amount of surface area. And clay is extremely charged, silt to a degree, but clay has a very, very charged surface, and silt does to a degree. And water sticks to those charged surfaces. So the more silt and clay you have in your soil, the more water holding capability the soil has. The sand is actually useful to allow the soil to drain so that water doesn't accumulate. Silt and clay, if that's all your soil is made out of, you'll get a very, very thick gelatinous mix very quickly. But the soil allows water to drain and create air spaces and all of that good stuff. So here, a loam is an ideal sort of soil for farming, and there's no dominant particle size. It's a pretty good mixture of all of these bits and pieces. All right, so when we look at soil, we want to be able to talk about these layers of soil. So let's go ahead and look at a picture right here, and then we'll go back to those descriptions. So the mineral parts of the soil, the more mineralized soil, the layers are fairly straightforward, A, B, C, as we go deeper and deeper. And we're making a transition from highly broken down, highly weathered mineral material in the A layer down to much, much more raw, only marginally broken apart mineral matter in this sea layer down here. And then below the sea layer is going to be the bedrock, what's called the parent material below this. All right. So the A, B, and C horizons represent various levels of mechanical and chemical erosion of the rock into a soil material. And then the O level is the organic layer right here, and it contains quite a bit of humus of organic material mixed in with some of this A horizon material. And a fair amount of this humus and organic material seeps down into the A layer here, a lot of that driven by animal movements, earthworms and things like that, burrowing and moving around in these layers, and to a lesser degree down here in the B horizon. So let's go back and take a look at our definitions. So remember, the top is the organic layer, or topsoil. Then we've got the A, B, and C horizons. And then finally, we're going to have a parent material underneath that. So this is in San Joaquin in California. And in this particular case right here, we see that the O layer is extraordinarily thin, very, very thin layer of organic material laying on top of a pretty substantial amount of loamy, sandy soil right here. And again, we're going to have an increase in the size of these layers as we work our way from the A, B, and down to the C horizons. And this is pretty typical right here between the B and C horizon, and a way of distinguishing them, along with particle size on either side of the barrier, is a layer of calcium and phosphate-rich salts right here. And this represents the point, where material has been, mineral materials have been collected by water, percolating down through the soil and depositing a layer of material right here. We'll have groundwater, issues down below here somewhere. So a cut of some sort is always interesting to look at if you're curious about soil structure and plant lives. A longitudinal cut in soil somewhere is very, very informative. It'll tell you a lot about the challenges that plants in this area are under. All right. A very important idea in terrestrial plants is the relationship between them and nitrogen, and specifically between those terrestrial plants and nitrogen fixing bacteria. And fixing means converting gaseous nitrogen into a soluble form. So binding nitrogen to other atoms so that we get a compound like ammonia. And there's also other possibilities. Nitrate and nitrite, NO2 and NO3, if I've got those right. I sometimes tend to reverse them, but nitrate and nitrite and ammonia are your three soluble forms that you find in soil routinely. N2 is a gas, does not dissolve into liquid very well, and is present, terrifically in the atmosphere, but only very, very sparingly in water. And because it's nonpolar, this molecule is nonpolar, N2 is nonpolar, it can't be effectively picked up and moved by plants. They can't act on it because it doesn't dissolve in water, and so it doesn't emit, it doesn't lend itself to any of the mechanisms plants have for pumping, for grabbing ions and moving them about and all of that. Whereas they can with ammonia because it dissolves in water. It's a polar molecule. It has charges, dissolves in water, and it attaches to proteins and therefore can be transported. So this is useful for plants. This is not. They do need the nitrogen. And of course, plants need nitrogen for the nitrogenous bases of their DNA and RNA, and for the amines on the amino acids of every protein, of every amino acid in each protein. So it's an absolutely crucial macronutrient needed in large amounts. Animals need it too, but we don't have quite the challenges plants do when we eat proteins and nucleic acids and DNA, but primarily proteins. That's where we get our nitrogen. We get that in our food and recycle that stuff and reuse it as necessary to, include in nitrogenous bases of nucleic acids and as the amines of new amino acids that we synthesize. So animals really just take advantage of plants to get their nitrogen. Plants have to get it out of the atmosphere via prokaryotic activity. So no plant can take N2 and convert it into ammonia. Plants can only use ammonia or nitrate or nitrite and rely on a short list of prokaryotic organisms, a bunch of heterotrophic soil bacteria, and then also the autotrophic cyanobacteria that we've looked at in laboratory, for instance. And these are the only organisms on Earth that can take gaseous nitrogen and fix it into a soluble form. And that costs, as you can see right here, a lot of ATP. This is a very expensive reaction to take one N2 molecule, 16 ATP to get one N2 gas molecule and get it into a soluble form. 16 ATP, that's terrifically expensive. And so the only reason these bacteria do it is because otherwise they don't have any ammonia either. They've got to have it, and they spend a terrific amount of their metabolic energy fixing that nitrogen into a soluble form. And what happens is, if they do this well, there's excess nitrogen in the environment around them in the soluble form, in the form of ammonia. They overproduce. And then lots and lots of other bacteria, and by extension plants, and then by extension animals, are all taking advantage of this excess ammonia that is introduced into soil by the nitrogen fixing activities of these soil bacteria and or cyanobacteria in bodies of water. This has been driven to such a this is such a critical relationship right here, that what's happened is that free living soil bacteria, and in some of the primitive plants, particularly things like cycads and some ferns, we have symbiotic relationships between the soil bacteria and the cyanobacteria and plants. So what happens is the plants release sugars primarily, which feed the bacteria or, are useful to cyanobacteria. A lot of times plants will release signal hormones that induce bacteria to grow opportunistically and preferentially somewhere near the plant, and then those bacteria are rewarded by sugars that leak out of the plants in exchange for the ammonia coming from the bacteria. And the variations on that same relationship exist with cyanobacteria. So all terrestrial plants do that sort of symbiotic relationship with free living nitrogen fixing bacteria, free living ones, or these cyanobacteria right here. As an illustration of just how important it is, there is one very large and very successful group of plants called the legumes. So this is beans, also referred to as Fabaceae. But the beans and all of their relatives, and this includes some things that you may not immediately think of as bean-producing plants, but think of an acacia tree in Africa, or the very similar-looking mesquite tree here in Texas. They have these seed pods that look like great big long beans, not the sort that you would eat necessarily, but they are bean plants. So they produce legumes, and they're related to the little green plants that we use, to produce peas and beans and stuff like that we eat. Anyway, the point is, all of the legumes have endosymbiotic relationships with bacteria. So they have in their roots special structures set up where they invite, basically recruit nitrogen-fixing bacteria to live inside these nodules right here, and in exchange for sugars, they overproduce soluble nitrogen in the form of ammonia. The chemical reaction, this reaction right here, works best in the absence of oxygen. If we have oxygen around, it spoils this chemical reaction right here. So in these root nodules right here, the plant will, this will be tissue that is not aerobic, so the cells are not going to have active mitochondria in them, and it's going to be a very low oxygen environment, which favors the biology of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They prefer to live in soil, in the water in soil, which has relatively low oxygen concentration, and they work anaerobically. These are anaerobic bacteria. And so in this environment, inside these nodules of these roots, these are these little nodules here and some extracted roots from a leguminosaceous plant. These nodules have these bacteria living here. So these plants have taken things to the next step and actually recruit and hold and grow their own nitrogen-fixing bacteria, really, within their own tissues. But each new plant needs to get a fresh inoculation. These don't come with the eggs. of a plant. So they haven't become a permanent symbiote in the lineage yet. Uh, Now, another very, very important symbiotic relationship that really pretty much all terrestrial plants, any ones that we take a look at, we tend to find these relationships right here, are between fungi and plants. Now, there are parasitic fungi, just like there are for people, ones that say cause skin diseases in humans and various other things. And there's some famous fungi that infiltrate and kill animals in order to propagate, particularly a lot of arthropods. But the vast bulk of fungi are free living. They live in soil. They extract minerals and water from that soil, and organic matter from decomposing dead things. So famously, fungi decomposing a tree trunk. The fungi didn't kill the tree and knock it down. They're taking advantage of the dead tree. Some other fungi may have killed the tree, but the ones that are decomposing that tree are typically benign. They're only metabolizing dead material. But remember, fungi are heterotrophs like animals, so they must get their organic matter from their environment. They can't make it themselves. They've got to get it from their environment. But classically, they're decomposers of recently living organic matter. Anyway, because they also must get minerals from the soil and water from soil to combine with their organic matter to make all of their macromolecules, just like we do. We need minerals in small amounts. Fungi are really good at doing this, and we set up these relationships where fungi specialize in extracting minerals from the soil, and transfer those to the roots of plants in exchange for sugars. Organic matter, freshly produced organic matter in its ideal form, sugar, transferred from the plant to the fungi by close association of fungal tissue with the tips of roots on those plants. And those associations of plant and fungal portions are called mycorrhizae. So the mycorrhizae are the associations of fibrous hyphae, which is the normal underground form that fungi take, long filamentous masses of stuff. The hyphae of fungus intertwined with the fine roots and root hairs and root tips of plants create these things called mycorrhizae. And so the benefit to the fungi here is that they get lots more carbon in the form of sugars that they're getting from those plants. The benefit for the plants is that they get more nutrients, more mineral nutrients from the soil. So let's be careful when we say nutrients here. For a fungus, sugar is a nutrient. For a plant, sugar is not a nutrient in the sense that they don't need to get it from their environment. They make it themselves. All right, so here's some examples of mycorrhizae. So you might say, oh, this has got a fungal infection. You're right, but in this case, it's a good one. Now, just some interesting little tidbits about plants. Most plants are autotrophic. Most plants are autotrophic. However, there are quite a few that are parasitic to some degree. 4,100 species is indicated right here, which is a very large number of plants. Remember, there's about 1,000 species of gymnosperms and about 300 species of flowering plants. And the vast bulk of the parasites we're talking about, and indeed the vast bulk of these parasitic plants are going to be flowering plants, angiosperms. As it says here, some do have chlorophyll. So if they do have chlorophyll, they can function autotrophically. Others do not. So they only function, heterotrophically, meaning they've got to get their sugar and their organic matter from their environment, just like fungi do. So that's what parasitic plants are. And so here we're looking at dodder, which is these thin yellow stems right here. Dodder has no leaves. It's got flowers. It's a flowering plant. It reproduces just like, other flowers, but it has no leaves. It has stems and it has roots that punch in to the vascular tissue of a host plant, both the xylem and the phloem, and they collect sugars from the phloem and water from the xylem, and water from the phloem as well. The dodder has no chlorophyll, can't make its own food, so it's an obligate parasite. So there's quite a few of these out here. Around here, the most familiar example is the mistletoe. If you take a look at mistletoe, let's take a peek at that one real quickly here. All right, I just pulled up a Google image search page and typed in mistletoe. And so y'all are familiar with these bunches of green stuff up on a tree. So this is mistletoe, and it is plugged into the vasculature of the host plant. In the case of mistletoe, which is very obviously green, and all these pictures here we're looking at mistletoe. This is a variant right here. This is holly. This is something else. But mistletoe right here is green, and that means it is photosynthetic. So typically it only taps into the xylem portion of the stem of the host plant right here. So it takes water and minerals from the host plant. So it's taking advantage of the tree's roots to get the water and minerals it needs, and the tree's branches to perch way up high close to the sunlight and away from competition down on the ground. The berries right here, these white berries, let me pull up this picture right here, indicate that it's a flowering plant, and these little green things are their flowers. It is insect and wind pollinated, but birds eat the berries, and when they defecate, perched on a tree somewhere, their feces will have the seed inside it, which is now active, and the seed germinates in the pile of bird feces right here. So each one of these, at least one of these got here, the first one. These others may be, popping out through vegetative propagation through the plant right here. But the first one, germinated from a seed that was caught on a crook in some bird feces on the bark right here. So that's how mistletoes all get around, which is pretty interesting. So they're parasitic symbionts of trees, and they have a symbiotic relationship with birds for the purposes of propagation, which is so typical of flowering plants. Flowering plants produce colorful, sweet smelling and sweet tasting flowers, or some flowers produce foul smelling and horrible tasting flowers. Those are pollinated by flies. But anyway, the flowers are meant to be a reward, an attractant, first an attractant, that's the color, and smell for moths and things with senses of smells like mammals. An attractant, and then rewards, that's going to be the nectar and the pollen, which is nutritious rewards for the pollinators, and then moving from one flower to another, the same species ensures cross-fertilization in flowering plants for the bulk of flowering plants. So they use animals as a means of reproducing by, pollinating of their flowers and or distributing their seeds. In the case of mistletoe right here, distributing the seeds is the major function of animal symbionts. All right. So there are a few, and these are much rarer, there are saprophytic plants. And again, they don't have any chlorophyll, so this is red, but it's not a photopigment right here, or at least, well, it may be. It may be a anthocyanin, yeah. But it's primarily they don't photosynthesize, and they are specialized for producing hydrolytic enzymes that break apart dead matter in the soil. So they're decomposers like bacteria and fungi. So there are a few plants that do that job as well. They've got some relatives that are the carnivorous plants that release digestive enzymes coupled with some sort of trap to trap an insect. Think of a pitcher plant or the Venus flytrap with its closing trapdoor. And what they do is they don't wait for, they don't take advantage of dead matter laying around. They go ahead and kill stuff right away and then digest it in order to get nitrogen. They're trying to get nitrogen. But they release lots and lots of digestive enzymes into those traps, into those pits, into the pitchers, onto the leaves of the folding leaves on the Venus flytrap in order to digest the insect, in order to get at its. They're not interested in the sugars. They're not interested in the proteins. They're interested in the ammonia in the proteins, the amine groups, and that's their source of nitrogen. They classically live in waterlogged soil that doesn't support much in the way of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The reason I'm talking about them here is because, like the saprophytes, they are specialists in producing lytic enzymes to break apart organic matter to get at what they need. And of course, what plants are trying to get at, since they're non-photosynthetic, they're going to have to go ahead and get their carbon out of the soil as well, so sugars and things like that. So they really do function like a heterotroph, unlike a Venus flytrap, which is an autotroph, which harvests nitrogen from the bodies of insects. All right, and that concludes this recording and this lesson on plant nutrition and soils.